Absolute Batman just met Wonder Woman for the very first time in the Absolute universe.
Peak fiction incoming.
And things did not go the way that I expected because they actually ended up throwing hands. So go grab your food, kick your smelly feet up, and prepare to jump into this issue. So initially our issue picks up in Gateway City at the residence of Veronica Kell, and while looking over her shoulder at a bunch of Batman and Wonder Woman merchandise, it's revealed that she's actually in the midst of a conversation with the one and only Jack Grimm. And as we learned from the last issue of Absolute Batman, Jack Grimm is the legal name of Absolute Joker. Nevertheless, him and Veronica's discussion was out of pure frustration with the heroes uprising lately, because the reason different kinds of Wonder Woman and Batman merch was popping up out of nowhere, whether it be in the form of a plushie or a chess set, was because people all over the world were slowly starting to become inspired by them after witnessing or hearing about their acts of heroism. As the first page comes to a close though, the Joker would then express that although the heroes were a big symbol, it also meant that they were big targets, before confirming that Wonder Woman was falling for some bait that they set up recently somewhere inside Gotham City. After that, we go over to Gotham City itself in the midst of a giant magical bat symbol being projected from a skyscraper as Batman was beating up some thugs in an alleyway. So after properly dealing with the thugs, he decided to get a closer look at the bat symbol by hanging from a nearby building, but before he could finish his observation, Absolute Wonder Woman suddenly appeared out of thin air, expressing that she was impressed with his ability to be so quiet, especially since he was such a big person. So Bruce unraveled himself from his bat cocoon before gliding on down to the source of the bat symbol and asking if she made it by using magic. And after confirming that that was indeed the case, Diana indicated that it seemed like the most polite way of getting his attention, stating that she didn't want to wander around his city uninvited, but he was a very hard man to find. As we move forward though, our two heroes would then properly introduce themselves before taking a seat on the ledge of the building, but because he was still curious about the source of Diana's powers, Bruce would then ask her if she could explain what her definition of magic was, so Diana emphasized that it was a form of advanced chemistry with unconventional intentions and unusual resources. But just like Bruce, Diana had her own curiosities as well, asking Bruce where he got the courage to hurl himself off of skyscrapers despite not having the ability to fly. But unwilling to give out too much information about himself, Bruce would simply imply that he did the things he did out of necessity. Shortly after that though, Diana figured it was time to cut to the chase and quit with the small talk, telling Bruce that her being in Gotham wasn't by accident because she needed his help solving a case about 4 murders. Knowing that his city was a freaking hellhole though, Bruce was confused about what was so special about these murders in particular, stating that 4 murders would barely even make it to the news these days. But according to Diana, these murders were different because at each one of the crime scenes there was a bloody version of the Mark of Hecate symbol, which was the same symbol that was placed on her right shoulder. Nevertheless, after that, Diana would bring up the fact that detective work wasn't really one of her strong points, but she did have a friend who was pretty good in that department who would help her when she came across a case like this. But that's when Bruce clearly started thinking of his own friends and how he negatively impacted their lives, stating that Diana should be careful with her exposure because even though she was a god, the people around her couldn't say the same thing. According to Diana though, that ship had already sailed and it was too late to go back into the shadows. And even if she could go back into hiding, she was pretty sure that she wouldn't do it because love was transformative and she didn't know how to show that to people without being a living example. However, as they continued chatting, eventually Diana told Bruce that he was incorrect about his assumption that she was a god, but because of a previous bet that she made with her mother Cersei, she was curious to know whether or not he was a god. Apparently her mother was positive that he was some sort of bat god upon seeing him for the first time in her scrying pool. Please like and comment. I'm so tired and exhausted. After Bruce confirmed that he was in fact just a normal person though, Diana would then gift him an enchanted talisman before explaining that if he was ever in need of her assistance then he could simply touch the talisman with his bare skin, and if she was on the same plane of existence as him then she would come to his aid immediately. Nevertheless, Diana would then ask if Bruce minded escorting her to the most recent crime scene so she could examine it for any clues, and that's when we get a cool little glimpse of him speeding on his bat cycle through the streets of Gotham City, with Diana following him closely above. After that, we see our two heroes arriving to a rundown house in the middle of Slaughter Swamp, and as they got closer to the front door, Diana asked how this crime scene was even discovered because it was in such a remote location. So Bruce indicated that it was kinda suspicious because the department received an anonymous tip. And from what he read in the police report, things weren't really adding up the way that they should have been. Soon enough, however, after using a spell to lead them to the main point of interest, Diana emphasized that a magical ritual had most definitely definitely taken place there, but she didn't believe it was in honor of her goddess Hecate, even though whoever committed the ritual was using Hecate's symbol, because instead of 7 candles, there would have either been 3, 6, or 9 candles on the symbol if they were truly Hecate's disciples, because she was what's referred to as a triple goddess. And in addition to that, there should have been at least 3 symbols in the area, and there was only 2. Some of the ingredients that they used were completely wrong, and if the killing was committed 2 days ago, then the moon was in the wrong position. Continuing to try putting the pieces together though, Diana would then ask Bruce if there were any organs missing from the victim's body, to which Bruce would confirm that not only were they missing their liver, but they were also missing their heart, also missing their stomach, and also missing their lungs. So that's when Diana came to the conclusion that whoever was responsible for doing this was trying to build something that was known as a golem, which was basically a magically constructed figure capable of being controlled remotely. However, Diana was still confused as to why they were trying to frame her goddess Hecate, because it didn't make any sense. So Bruce theorized that maybe they only used Hecate's symbol for the purpose of getting Diana's attention and luring them into a trap. Nevertheless, moments later, upon Diana asking if they could go to the other crime scenes, Bruce indicated that they should be more proactive by going to an abandoned church that he found within the case files. But upon their arrival to the church, Bruce expressed that they needed to be careful because it was probably lined with traps from top to bottom, because it was clear that there was people inside at the top of the clock tower. So Diana asked him if he minded being carried for a few brief moments so they could enter from the top of the church and skip any unnecessary hurdles. That's when we get a glimpse of what was happening in the clock tower, which was basically yet another ritual being performed by 7 cloaked figures. Soon enough, however, once they were in position, Diana let go of Bruce's arms, allowing him to fall through the sky before cannonballing in through the ceiling, but to both him and Wonder Woman's surprise, none of the cloaked figures had any sort of reaction. So Bruce began walking towards them while indicating that they had to be in some sort of altered state, but that's when one of the cloaked figures used some sort of magical gesture to force both of our heroes inside of their circle. So Bruce asked her if leaving the circle would be a good idea, but Diana implied that it was already too late to do so. Nevertheless, upon further examination, Diana emphasized that it looked like the body they were working on was unfinished, which Bruce assumed was good news, but according to Diana, it might have been bad news, because they may not have been trying to build somebody to control, but instead trying to control somebody else who was already built. Before getting to see how their situation unravels though, our story then jumps back over to Veronica's discussion with the Joker, and eventually they start talking about Diana's creation, stating that supposedly she was the last Amazon ever who was miraculously crafted out of clay, and if this legend was true, then she was nothing more than a fancy golem. And as we stated earlier, a golem is a magically constructed figure that was capable of being controlled remotely, and that's when we see the terrifying moment when Diana's body slowly started being consumed by complete and utter darkness. But knowing that she needed to help Batman before she was fully consumed, Diana not only implied that he needed to get as far away from her as possible, but then literally remove her own magical arm from her body so she couldn't use it to inflict harm. However, once Bruce made it to the bottom of the stairwell, Diana would then block his path by slamming her body in front of the exit before latching her hand around his neck and flying back up to the tower. Nevertheless, Bruce would then answer back by trying to wrap her up in one of his bat tendrils, but unsurprisingly, Diana dodged it with ease. So Bruce grabbed onto a nearby pipe so he could evade Diana's following attack, but even after throwing some smoke bombs and jamming his battle axe into her thigh, Diana was still able to smash him into a nearby wall by kicking him across the room, and as if things couldn't get any worse, Diana would then rip his battle axe out of her leg and slowly began walking in his direction. So Bruce continued trying to get through to her and eventually resorted to spraying some knockout gas, but because it didn't have any effect on her, he then realized that his only chance of survival was pulling out the talisman. However, upon taking it out of his belt, she then latched onto his leg, trying to keep him from using it at all costs. But thankfully, he was eventually able to touch it with his bare skin, just like she instructed him to, by using his teeth to rip off his glove, which just barely kept Diana from just completely chopping his head off. Upon Diana coming back to her senses though, there were still some unsolved mysteries, because she claimed that the spell they used on her wouldn't have worked if they didn't have her own hair and blood, and there was no telling how exactly they were able to obtain them. As we move forward though, the princess would then suggest they destroy the body that the witches were using so it couldn't be used for further harm, but that's when Batman realized that the tower was rigged with explosives, so without a single moment of hesitation, he pulled Diana into his arms before smashing their way outside of the building. After that though, our story jumps back over to Veronica, slamming her fist onto her desk and breaking a glass in the process of doing so, because obviously she wasn't very happy that the heroes escaped. Nevertheless, after the Joker assured that it wasn't that big of a deal because they'd have more chances in the future, Veronica would then indicate that it was crucial crucial that they stop them from gathering more disciples, because if they continued to do so, then everything was gonna come crashing down. However, our story then brings us back over to our heroes laying next to each other in the dirt after escaping certain death, and upon Diana realizing that somebody wanted both of them dead, Bruce jokingly expressed that he had a list of suspects in one of his other pants before asking Diana if she was really a golem. So Diana told him no, but apparently the unconventional nature of her birth was leaving her open to some attacks that she had never considered. Moments later though, Diana remembered that in addition to the talisman, she also brought Bruce another gift, pulling out a USB drive that was given to her by a government scientist, because apparently it had a ton of information about the up and coming heroes. And this part was super cool because Bruce actually acknowledges that he was already aware of Absolute Superman. Nevertheless, it would then start snowing, and because Diana had been raised in hell her entire life, this was actually her first time experiencing the snow. And as our issue comes to a close, Diana would then express that she believed her and Bruce were going to be such good friends that one day he might even tell her his real name, but Bruce suspected that she already knew what his name was, so he then tell her to say it out loud, and it's here that Diana says, "Bruce, don't you think we should make friends with Superman too? I think we're gonna need a lot of friends if we're gonna save the world." And then she'd ask Hecate to bless him, to which Batman responded, "Happy holidays, Diana." But sadly, that's where our issue comes to an end though, but if you guys want to see what happens next, let me know in the comments down below.